Kings, queens, poison, and jaw-dropping scandals. Discover the secret lives of Europe's most cursed royal families, where power came with a deadly price.
Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we're dimming the lights, settling in, and drifting back to the 16th century. A century full of ruffles, religious wars, and people who thought bathing was optional. So get cozy, sip some tea, and let's talk about one of the most infamous women in European history, Catherine de Medici, the so-called Poison Queen. Now, Catherine probably didn't start her life planning to become a walking nightmare for half of France. She was, believe it or not, a rather unassuming Italian girl, born in 1519 in Florence into the famous but often bankrupt Medici family. You know the Medicis, Renaissance banking moguls, art sponsors, occasional popes, occasional poisoners, depending on the rumor mill. Her father, Lorenzo de Medici, Duke of Urbino, died when she was a baby. Her mother, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, also died shortly after giving birth. So, Catherine entered the world as a tiny orphan with a massive inheritance and zero parental supervision, which in the 1500s was a bit like putting a diamond in a pit of rats and hoping for the best. For the first few years, she was raised by various relatives, each one probably more interested in her money than her well-being. Then, as if that wasn't enough family drama, Florence itself decided to rebel against the Medici clan, forcing baby Catherine to flee for her life. She was literally taken hostage by anti-Medici forces and locked away in convents. Now, Catherine actually loved convent life. The nuns fed her, educated her, and didn't try to kill her for her last name. She later said those were some of her happiest years, which tells you everything you need to know about how the rest of her life went. Eventually, the Pope, who conveniently was also her uncle, decided to play family savior and marry her off to someone important, and who better than a French prince? Enter Henry, Duke of Orleans. Later, King Henry II of France. Catherine was 14 when she was shipped off to France in 1533, a teenage pawn in the most expensive political chess game of the century. Her dowry was enormous, her Italian accent was strong, and her French, at that point, was non-existent. And her new husband? Completely uninterested. Because, of course, Henry was already deeply in love with another woman, Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years older than him who managed to be both his mentor and mistress. Catherine was, understandably, not thrilled to find that her marriage came with a permanent third wheel. But she handled it the way she'd handle everything else in her life, quietly, strategically, and with an unnerving patience. Diane, meanwhile, wasn't subtle. She dressed in black and white to match Henry's colors, dictated political appointments, and even decided what the Queen could wear. Catherine would later say she was treated more like a servant than a wife, and honestly, she kind of was. Still, Catherine waited. For a decade. That's 10 years of smiling politely while your husband parades his mistress in front of you at dinner. She had no children for the first 10 years of marriage, which made everyone whisper that she was barren. And in the 16th century Europe, barren was basically a death sentence for a queen. But, plot twist, she wasn't. Eventually, she started popping out kids like a determined overachiever. 10 of them, in fact. 7 survived to adulthood, which, for the Renaissance, was an impressive batting average. Her husband finally noticed her, sort of, after that. But by then, Catherine had learned to play the long game. She watched, she listened, and she started collecting people. Advisors, astrologers, apothecaries, especially one named Ruggieri, who had a reputation for dabbling in alchemy and poisons, because, of course she did. Now,
Before you imagine Catherine cackling over bubbling potions in a candlelit dungeon, slow down. There's no solid proof that she personally poisoned anyone. But it's also France in the 1500s, and everyone was dying mysteriously, so you can see where the rumors started. Catherine's fascination with the occult didn't help. She kept horoscopes for her children, consulted astrologers for every major decision, and built secret rooms in her palaces for experiments. You know, the kind of experiments that probably didn't involve cute frogs and safety goggles. When Henry II died in 1559 after a freak jousting accident involving a splinter to the eye, because of course he did, Catherine finally stepped out of the shadows. She wore mourning black for the rest of her life, symbolically sidelined Diane de Poitiers, and took control of France through her sickly teenage sons. Her first son, Francis II, was 15, married to Mary, Queen of Scots, and already dying of an ear infection. Catherine basically ruled for him until he promptly died a year later. Then came Charles IX, who was 10. Catherine ruled for him too. And this is where the Poison Queen title really starts to make sense. France was tearing itself apart in religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, the Huguenots. Catherine, trying to balance power, hosted fancy peace banquets and arranged marriages to unite the factions, which sounds sweet until you realize one of those weddings led directly to the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a bloody purge of Huguenots so brutal it scarred Europe for generations. Now, whether Catherine actually ordered it, encouraged it, or just couldn't stop it, historians still debate. But the timing, planning, and eerie calm with which she reacted afterwards didn't exactly help her reputation. Let's float over, quietly, to her later years. Catherine continued her regency under her next son, Henry III, her favorite child, the most flamboyant king France ever had. Think pearls, perfumes, and cross-dressing pageants. Catherine adored him. The nobility? Not so much. By then, Catherine was an old woman, exhausted, haunted by politics and loss. Most of her children had died young. Her dynasty was collapsing, and France was still on fire, sometimes literally. She spent her last years trying to hold the country together with diplomatic duct tape and sheer stubbornness. When she finally died in 1589, people whispered that her death was divine punishment. The rumor mill churned for centuries, painting her as a sorceress, a murderer, a manipulative puppet master. And maybe she was some of those things. Or maybe she was just a woman born into a snake pit who learned to bite first. As for her legacy, well, let's just say when history nicknames you the Poison Queen, you don't get to rest easy.
Part 2. The Shadow of Catherine. The poison legacy spreads through Europe. Hey again. Still awake? Or at least pleasantly half asleep? Perfect. Tonight we continue floating through the fumes of French royal politics, because apparently poison was just the perfume of the 16th century. So we left off with Catherine de Medici, the so-called Poison Queen, finally dead and buried in 1589. You'd think the story would calm down there. But no, because Catherine, in true Medici fashion, left behind more chaos than peace. Her sons were all dead, her dynasty was collapsing, and her political style, the whole smile while slipping metaphorical poison into everyone's cup thing, would echo across Europe for generations. Let's ease back into the candlelit corridors of post-Catherine France. The Valois dynasty was wheezing its last breath, and France was basically one nervous breakdown away from total implosion. Her son, Henry III, had been assassinated by a monk, because apparently stabbing kings in the name of religion was the national pastime now. Enter Henry of Navarre, soon to become Henry IV of France, a Protestant, a warrior, And worst of all, in the eyes of Catherine's ghost, not Italian. He would eventually convert to Catholicism with the famous shrug, "Paris is worth a mass," which, to be fair, is one of history's greatest lines of political self-preservation. Now, Henry IV didn't share Catherine's taste for poisons or astrology. He was more of a food and fun kind of guy. But her legacy still haunted the French court. Catherine's network of Italian apothecaries, astrologers, and shady physicians had firmly taken root in royal life. You couldn't walk 10 steps in the Louvre without tripping over someone who sold love elixirs or miracle tonics that probably contained enough mercury to kill a small horse. One of those snake oil specialists was a woman named Marie de Brinvilliers, who decided to make Catherine's legend look like a mild hobby. Marie was a 17th century noblewoman who turned poisoning into kind of grim domestic art form. Her method? Sprinkle arsenic into soup, tea, maybe a little pastry. She killed her father, then her brothers, then planned to off her husband. She even tested her poisons on hospital patients, because, apparently, empathy wasn't fashionable in France yet. When she was finally caught, her trial became a national spectacle. People whispered she'd inherited Catherine's poisoning playbook. And honestly, she might have. Because Catherine's court had normalized the idea that medicine, love, and murder could all come from the same little vial. But while France was busy perfecting powdered death, Italy, Catherine's homeland, was having its own toxic renaissance. Enter Giulia Tofana, another woman whose resume could best be described as murder, but make it marketable. Giulia lived in Rome in the 1600s and ran what was essentially a poison startup. Her product? A blend called Aqua Tofana. It was colorless, tasteless, and wildly effective. She sold it in cute little bottles labeled Mana of St. Nicholas. So it looked holy, which is just chef's kiss level of irony. Her target customers were mostly women trapped in abusive marriages, wives with no legal way to escape except through creative chemistry. Giulia's poison empire reportedly helped kill over 600 men. That's not a typo. 600. She became so famous that Tofana became a verb, as in, he's been tofana'd. Eventually, the authorities caught her because apparently mass poisoning has limits. She confessed under torture, though given the methods of 17th century interrogations, she probably would have confessed to inventing the moon if they asked. Still, her legend spread across Europe. And guess who people blamed for inspiring her? That's right, Catherine de Medici. The myth of the Poison Queen had officially gone viral. So, was any of this fair? Probably not. Catherine's actual role in poisoning the people is still debated by historians. She was certainly manipulative, ruthless, and politically brilliant, but direct murder, the evidence is foggy. Yet her image as the dark matriarch of toxic femininity stuck, especially in France, where male chroniclers were always eager to blame ambitious women for everything from plagues to bad weather. Let's drift over to England for a moment, because the English were obsessed with Catherine's reputation. Elizabethan playwrights turned her into a Gothic villainess before Gothic villainess was even a genre. They portrayed her mixing potions in smoky rooms, summoning astrologers, and plotting everyone's downfall with a cat on her lap. Ironically, Queen Elizabeth I was doing something similar, minus the poison. Elizabeth had her own army of spies, her own secret network of doctors and alchemists. The difference? She just had better PR. Meanwhile, back in France, Catherine's surviving descendants, through her daughter Marguerite and distant Bourbon relatives, inherited not just her blood, but her flair for dysfunction. The Bourbon kings that followed, Louis XIII, Louis XIV, and the whole Versailles soap opera, carried whispers of Medici superstition in their veins.
Louis XIV's court, for example, became the backdrop of the infamous Affair of the Poisons in the 1670s. Picture this. France's most glittering nobles, dressed in gold lace and wigs taller than your house, secretly buying poisons, love potions, and curses from underground witches. It all started when people started mysteriously dropping dead. Husbands, rivals, mistresses. And investigators traced it back to a network of fortune tellers and apothecaries in Paris. The clients? The crème de la crème of society. Even Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's mistress, was implicated. She allegedly used black masses and poison to keep the king's affection. Sound familiar? It should, because this was Catherine's legacy, a century later. Poison as a political tool, astrology as strategy, murder wrapped in silk and incense. The French police executed dozens, tortured hundreds, and buried the scandal under royal silence. But the damage was done. The Poison Queen wasn't just one woman anymore. She was a mythic archetype, a warning, a fascination, and a bedtime story that Europe couldn't stop retelling. Let's slow down for a moment, because beneath the melodrama, there's something strangely human about Catherine's story. She lived in a time when women, even queens, had almost no direct power. The tools they had were influence, manipulation, and occasionally, creative use of chemistry. So yes, Catherine may have leaned into superstition. She may have surrounded herself with astrologers and alchemists, but so did half the men in her court. They just got called scientists. She was pragmatic in a world that punished women for being anything other than ornamental. Even her fascination with poison wasn't unique. It was practical. Poisons were the 16th century equivalent of political insurance. Everyone carried antidotes, everyone suspected everyone else, and no one trusted the kitchen staff. The only difference is that Catherine got blamed for it in every generation after. By the time the Enlightenment rolled around, historians and playwrights turned her into a moral lesson. She became the wicked queen trope before Disney existed, the woman who smiled, plotted, and poisoned her way to power. But if you peel back the rumors, what's left is a deeply lonely woman, orphaned, unloved, underestimated, who learned to survive in a world built to destroy her. Maybe she didn't pour poison into anyone's cup. Maybe she just taught her enemies to expect that she could. Let's drift forward now, softly, into the quieter aftermath of her legend. By the 18th century, France had moved on to new scandals, revolutions, executions, and more guillotines than anyone ordered. But the Medici name lingered in the shadows of memory, a faint scent of power and paranoia that never fully disappeared. Her descendants by marriage would rule France, Spain, and parts of Italy. They'd intermarry so obsessively that royal portraits began to look like genetic copy-paste errors, which honestly feels like poetic justice. The woman accused of poisoning bloodlines ended up literally shaping them. And so, by the time the French Revolution rolled around, when the people finally rose up to cut off their monarchs' heads, they were, in a sense, cutting off the last ghostly tendrils of Catherine's influence. The Poison Queen had died centuries earlier, but her shadow still sat at the table.
Part 3. Lucrezia Borgia, the original Renaissance femme fatale. Hey there, sleepy historians. Still here? Good. Let's keep floating down this dark and velvety river of royal dysfunction. Tonight's current carries us to Italy again, home of art, ambition, and families who made modern soap operas look like bedtime stories for toddlers. We're leaving behind Catherine de Medici's cold marble halls of France and gliding a few decades backward, to Rome around 1480. The air is heavy with incense, gossip, and the faint metallic smell of corruption. Popes aren't exactly holy, cardinals are running side hustles, and everyone's favorite pastime seems to be poisoning their relatives before breakfast.
And right in the middle of that chaos, a golden-haired girl named Lucrezia Borgia. She's remembered by history as the Renaissance poison princess, the seductive, scheming, deadly beauty who supposedly murdered her lovers with a secret ring that dripped venom. The kind of reputation you only get when your last name is Borgia and your dad is the Pope. So, yeah, let's start there. Lucrezia was born in 1480, the illegitimate daughter of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, a Spanish nobleman stationed in Rome who was, in modern terms, a man of God with a flexible interpretation of celibacy. He had several children by multiple mistresses, but Lucrezia was his favorite. His father would later become Pope Alexander VI, arguably one of the most corrupt men ever to wear the papal tiara. Imagine the Vatican as a Netflix drama. Bribery, secret lovers, and family power grabs, except everyone's wearing robes. When Rodrigo became pope in 1492, Lucrezia was just 12, which in Renaissance years was the perfect age to start ruining her life with strategic marriages. Her first engagement came before she was even out of childhood. She was promised, then unpromised, to half a dozen noble families as her father's political alliances shifted like quicksand. You can almost imagine little Lucrezia sitting with her embroidery, quietly watching cardinals haggle over her like she was fine Venetian glassware. Her first actual marriage happened when she was 13, to Giovanni Sforza, a minor noble from Milan. The wedding was extravagant, the dowry was obscene, and within a few years, the whole thing went up in flames. Why? Because the Borgias decided Giovanni wasn't politically useful anymore. The Pope wanted to ally with Naples instead, so he needed Lucrezia free. Divorce wasn't easy, even for a Pope's daughter. So, Rodrigo and Lucrezia's brother, Cesare, did what any reasonable family would do. They accused Giovanni of being impotent. Imagine being that guy, publicly humiliated, excommunicated, and forced to sign a document saying you couldn't perform in bed, all to annul a political marriage. Unsurprisingly, he didn't take it well. Giovanni fled Rome, shouting that the Borgias were incestuous monsters. And just like that, the world had its first Borgia scandal. Now, about that incest rumor. It's been floating around since the 1490s, and like all good historical gossip, it's impossible to prove and too juicy to die. People claimed Lucrezia had affairs with her father, her brother Cesare, or both. Others said she had an illegitimate child that the family quietly erased. Modern historians, after scraping away centuries of slander, tend to agree that the incest thing was probably propaganda, spread by enemies of the Borgias, of which there were many. Still, the image stuck. It always does. Because the idea of a beautiful blonde papal daughter playing poison games with her equally beautiful brother was just too scandalous for Renaissance minds to resist. Now, let's pause for a second and talk about that brother. Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's favorite sibling, her shadow, and the man Machiavelli himself would later model the prince on. He was ruthless, brilliant, and handsome in that terrifying Renaissance warlord kind of way. Cesare started as a cardinal, ditched the church when he got bored, and carved himself a private empire out of central Italy using equal parts charm and murder. Lucrezia adored him. Cesare adored her. They wrote letters full of affection and shared secrets, which probably didn't help the whole incest rumor problem. But theirs was a political partnership as much as a personal bond. She was his public face, his ally, his pawn, and maybe his conscience, though not a very effective one. After her first disastrous marriage ended, Lucrezia was quickly remarried, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, a young, handsome prince from Naples, and for once she seemed genuinely happy. Contemporary letters suggest they actually liked each other, which in Renaissance politics was basically witchcraft. Unfortunately, the rest of her family did not share her enthusiasm. Cesare saw Alfonso as a threat to his military ambitions, and when Cesare saw a threat, the solution was usually a knife. In 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He survived the initial stabbing, but while recovering in bed, he was strangled by Cesare's men, probably while Lucrezia wept nearby. The Vatican, of course, declared it a tragic accident, because that's what the Borgias called most of their murders. After that, something changed in Lucrezia. The sunny, naive girl was gone. In her place stood a calm, calculating woman who smiled through the horror. When the Pope announced her next marriage to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, she didn't resist. She packed her gowns, her jewels, and her trauma and left Rome for good. Ferrara was, by Renaissance standards, a surprisingly sane place. Its court prized art, poetry, and diplomacy over assassination. And in this new environment, Lucrezia blossomed, or maybe reinvented herself. She became a patron of artists and writers. She sponsored charities, corresponded with scholars, and ruled her duchy with quiet efficiency. Even her husband, who had initially loathed the idea of marrying a Borgia, came to respect her. By the time Pope Alexander VI died in 1603, suddenly, possibly of poisoning, irony alert, Lucrezia had already transformed from infamous temptress to respected duchess. But public opinion is hard to rewrite. Pamphlets, plays, and whispered stories kept painting her as the femme fatale of Europe. People swore she carried a hollow ring filled with poison used to discreetly eliminate enemies during banquets. Some said she laced her fans with toxins. Others claimed she had secret rooms filled with alchemical concoctions. The truth is, she probably didn't poison anyone. Or if she did, she was subtle enough that nobody ever proved it, which honestly is impressive. Let's glide gently to her later years, when the scandals had faded, but the ghosts lingered. Lucrezia gave birth to several children, though she suffered many miscarriages. Letters from this time show her as pious, melancholy, and often sickly. The glamour was gone. The gold hair turned gray. In 1519, after giving birth to her last child, she developed a fever and died at 39. Her husband wept. Her people mourned. Rome, predictably, smirked. Centuries later, historians would debate her legacy endlessly. Was she a monster, a victim, or just a woman doing her best in a world where men controlled the narrative? Probably a mix of all three. But here's the irony. Lucrezia Borgia, the so-called poison princess, outlived her father's papacy, her brother's empire, and her own monstrous legend. She turned scandal into survival. And in a way, she and Catherine de Medici were spiritual twins across time. Both women born into political storms. Both accused of crimes they probably didn't commit. Both used as symbols of dangerous female power. And both blamed for the sins of the men around them. Let's float back out of Ferrara now. The candlelight dimming, the marble halls fading into darkness. Lucrezia's story, like so many of these royal tragedies, ends not with a bang, but a sigh. But we're not quite done with Europe's toxic aristocracy yet, because after the Borgias and the Medicis came another dynasty that took corruption, vanity, and bloodline obsession to architectural levels, the Habsburgs, a family so inbred they practically defied biology.
Part 4. The Habsburg Curse, a dynasty too inbred to rule. Hey again, Night Owl. You made it. One last candle still flickers in this long, strange gallery of royal dysfunction, and tonight, that soft golden light falls on the most cursed dynasty Europe ever produced, the Habsburgs. If Catherine de Medici was the poison queen and Lucrezia Borgia was the femme fatale, then the Habsburgs were, well, the genetic experiment that went horribly, horribly wrong. So pour yourself another cup of something warm, tuck the blanket under your chin, and prepare to meet a family that proves, beyond all doubt, that marrying your cousin 19 times in a row is not a great long-term plan. Let's start at the beginning. Austria, 13th century. The Habsburgs began as a minor noble house with a castle perched above the river Aar in what's now Switzerland. They clawed their way into power through a combination of marriages, politics, and, let's be honest, luck. By the 15th century, they'd mastered their family motto: let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. It sounds poetic until you realize it's basically a slogan for strategic inbreeding. See, the Habsburgs didn't fight for land, they married for it. And it worked. Their wedding rings conquered more territory than most armies. Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Netherlands, all linked by blood, vows, and increasingly tangled family trees. But here's where things started melting a bit. When you marry your cousin, your genes start running in circles. When you marry your cousin's cousin's cousin for 300 years straight, your family portrait starts looking like a mirror funhouse drawn by a tired geneticist. The result? The infamous Habsburg jaw. It wasn't just a slight overbite. It was a full architectural feature. Massive lower lips, elongated chins, and facial proportions that would make Picasso weep. You could spot a Habsburg from across a ballroom by the way their chin arrived 5 seconds before the rest of their face. This wasn't just cosmetic, either. It caused speech difficulties, eating problems, and chronic jaw pain. Yet somehow, the family decided, yes, let's keep doing that. Because marrying outsiders might risk losing power. The perfect example of this madness? Charles II of Spain. Let's dim the lights a little lower for him. He was the final tragic fruit of 2 centuries of relentless cousin weddings. Born in 1661, Charles was the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who, if you're keeping score, were uncle and niece. So that's already not ideal. Charles was born frail, sickly, and unable to speak until age 4. His tongue was too large for his mouth, his chin too long, and his mind developed slowly. By all accounts, he was sweet-natured, but utterly incapable of ruling. His birth was seen as both a miracle and a curse, the living embodiment of divine punishment for centuries of royal arrogance. Even his tutors called him the Bewitched. Now, in fairness, Charles II tried. He really did. He loved animals, art, and theology. But physically, he was a wreck. He had epilepsy, rickets, stomach disorders, and apparently could not chew solid food without assistance. By his 30s, he looked twice his age and was surrounded by priests, physicians, and exorcists, because, of course, the court blamed his ailments on witchcraft. You could almost imagine Catherine de Medici and Lucrezia Borgia peering down from their afterlife balconies, whispering, "Oh, honey, it's not witchcraft, it's chromosomes." Charles II's mother, Mariana, essentially ruled in his place. She was clever and domineering, but her regency only deepened the instability. Spain was collapsing economically, militarily, and genetically all at once. Charles desperately wanted an heir, but his body refused. He married twice,
both times to beautiful foreign princesses who quickly realized they were expected to produce a child with a man who barely understood how biology worked. No heirs ever came. His autopsy later revealed he had a single shriveled testicle, among other tragic details best left to your imagination. When he died in 1700, at the age of 38, the Habsburg line in Spain ended. With a thud and a European war over who'd get the scraps. The War of Spanish Succession would tear the continent apart for years, all because one poor man's family couldn't stop marrying each other. But let's not blame it all on Charles. His family tree was a masterpiece of genetic recursion. Historians have calculated that over 80% of his blood came from just 5 ancestors. That's not diversification, that's a human loop-de-loop. If you traced his lineage on paper, it looked less like a tree and more like a snake eating its own tail. Now, you might think the Austrian Habsburgs, the other branch of the family, would have learned from this. Spoiler, they didn't. They just did it slightly better. Instead of imploding genetically, they collapsed politically, but with style. The Austrian Habsburgs gave us some truly fascinating characters. Emperor Rudolf II, for instance, he ruled from 1776 to 1212 and spent most of his reign collecting alchemists, astrologers, and exotic animals. He turned Prague Castle into a museum of weirdness, a cabinet of curiosities filled with everything from mechanical birds to mystical relics. Rudolf believed he could unlock the secrets of immortality through science and magic. He sponsored experiments in alchemy and astrology, surrounded himself with fortune tellers, and occasionally forgot to govern his empire. He was eccentric, yes, but also deeply unstable. He suffered from severe depression, paranoia, and possibly schizophrenia. Historians suspect his erratic behavior stemmed from, you guessed it, generations of inbreeding. Eventually, his brother deposed him, citing mental unfitness. Rudolf died alone, surrounded by dusty relics and abandoned dreams. The perfect Habsburg ending. But even at their lowest, the Habsburgs never lost their flair for self-importance. They continued to marry strategically to cousins, nieces, and distant relatives, keeping the dynasty alive well into the 19th century. By then, they ruled over Austria-Hungary, an empire so sprawling and diverse that no one, including the Habsburgs themselves, really understood how it worked. And yet, the inbreeding never entirely stopped. The famous Emperor Franz Joseph, who ruled during the 19th century, was married to his own cousin, the Empress Sissi. Now, Sissi was a different kind of royal tragedy. She wasn't deformed or diseased, she was stunningly beautiful, rebellious, and lonely. Married young into the stiff, ceremonial court of Vienna, she became obsessed with her looks, her diet, and her freedom. She exercised compulsively, lived on broth and oranges, and avoided her husband as much as possible. Her story ended violently, assassinated by an Italian anarchist in 1898, but by then, the Habsburgs were already ghosts of their former glory. The final act came with Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne. You know, the guy whose assassination in 1914 set off World War I. He married for love, a novelty in that family, and paid for it politically. When he was killed in Sarajevo, the dominoes fell, and the world changed forever. It's fitting, in a dark way, that the family who spent centuries marrying for power finally fell because one of them married for affection. Let's float back for a moment. Over centuries of portraits, palaces, and politics, you'll notice something eerie about these royal stories. Whether it's Catherine de Medici whispering to her astrologers, Lucrezia Borgia smiling through scandal, or Charles II of Spain struggling beneath the weight of his own genes, they all share a theme: power, but without control. They were trapped by family, by politics, by their own myths. Catherine learned to poison because she couldn't command. Lucrezia learned to charm because she couldn't fight. Charles inherited centuries of ambition, but not the body to bear it. And the Habsburgs, well, they just kept marrying mirrors. By the 20th century, when the last emperor, Charles I, abdicated in 1918, the dynasty...
Part 5. The Last Empress. The Fall of Europe's Poisoned Bloodlines. Welcome back, insomniac historian. You've survived the poison, the scandals, the curses, and the chins. But before we snuff out the final candle of this long, haunted hallway, there's one last story left to tell. The slow, graceful, and heartbreaking death of monarchy itself. This is the story of the last empress. The woman who stood at the edge of centuries, watching everything her ancestors built crumble into smoke. And in her fall, she carried the last heartbeat of Europe's royal bloodlines, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the dreams of divine right. So one more time, pull the blanket close, dim the light, and listen to the quiet unraveling of empires. The stage before the fall. By the late 19th century, Europe was an empire-shaped museum. The great monarchies, Britain, Russia, Austria, Prussia, all glittered with gold, tradition, and very old people pretending the world wasn't changing. Steam engines were roaring, factories were smoking, people were reading Karl Marx, and revolutions were practically a weekend hobby. But inside the palaces, it was still chandeliers, powdered wigs, and family trees that could be mistaken for spaghetti diagrams. The Habsburgs sat in Vienna, the Romanovs in St. Petersburg, the Hohenzollerns in Berlin, and the Windsors, well, the Saxe-Coburgs before they rebranded mid-World War I, in London. And they were all, every single one of them, related. Cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, bloodlines looping like a royal Mobius strip. Europe was one big, glittering, inbred family reunion. Which brings us to Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sissi, the restless ghost of the 19th century. Sissi wasn't born to be an empress. She was a Bavarian princess, carefree, horse-loving, spontaneous. When she was 15, she accompanied her older sister to meet Emperor Franz Joseph, who was supposed to propose to the sister. Instead, Franz Joseph took one look at Sissi, shy, wide-eyed, full of life, and said, "Nope, I want her." And just like that, a teenage girl became Empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It sounds romantic, right? Spoiler, it wasn't. Vienna's imperial court was suffocating, a nest of etiquette, politics, and old ladies with opinions about everything. Sissi hated it. She hated the ceremonies, the endless gossip, and the way her overbearing mother-in-law controlled her children. So she did what Habsburgs rarely did. She rebelled. She became obsessed with controlling the only thing she could, her body. She exercised compulsively, refused to eat more than broth and fruit, and wrapped her waist so tightly it measured barely 20 inches. Her hair reached her ankles. Caring for it took 3 hours a day. She wrote melancholic poetry about death, freedom, and the ocean, longing to escape the golden cage she lived in. Sissi wasn't just a beauty icon. She was a woman suffocating under centuries of royal expectations. And her life would end, fittingly, at the hands of an anarchist who didn't even know who she was. In 1898, while walking by Lake Geneva, a man approached her with a sharpened file. He stabbed her through the heart, a small wound, almost invisible. She didn't realize she was dying until moments later. Her last words were quiet. "What has happened to me?" The empress who wanted freedom finally got it by leaving everything behind. The end of an empire. Sissy's death shattered Emperor Franz Joseph. He withdrew into duty, mourning quietly as Europe began to hum with the sound of progress and of rebellion. By the early 20th century, the empire was crumbling. Industrialization had created a new middle class. Nationalist movements were rising across Hungary, Bohemia, and the Balkans. And the royal family? Still pretending it was 1750. Enter Franz Ferdinand, the emperor's heir, and perhaps the only Habsburg who saw the writing on the palace wall. Franz Ferdinand was intelligent, stubborn, and surprisingly modern-minded. He believed the empire could survive by transforming, giving its many ethnic groups autonomy within a federal structure. But his biggest rebellion wasn't political. It was personal. He fell in love with Sophie Kotek, a lady-in-waiting. Noble, yes, but not noble enough. In Habsburg terms, she might as well have been a baker's daughter. Franz insisted on marrying her. The court said absolutely not. He said absolutely yes. Eventually, Emperor Franz Joseph relented, on one cruel condition. Their children could never inherit the throne. It was the ultimate royal punishment. You can marry for love, but love will end your line. They married anyway, and for a while they were happy. They had 3 children and avoided the toxic court life as much as possible. Until, of course, they visited Sarajevo in June 1914. The shot that shook the world. The morning of June 28, 1914, was supposed to be ceremonial. A little parade, some local goodwill. Instead, it became the start of the bloodiest war the world had ever seen. A group of Serbian nationalists plotted to assassinate Franz Ferdinand. Their first attempt failed. A bomb missed the car. Later that morning, fate and bad driving delivered the Archduke right into the path of Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old revolutionary. 2 shots, Sophie first, then Franz. Both died in the car, holding each other. The empire that had survived plague, poison, and centuries of inbreeding could not survive love and nationalism colliding in a single moment. Those 2 gunshots echoed through every palace in Europe. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia mobilized, Germany followed. France and Britain joined in. World War I had begun. And with it, the death of monarchy as the world had known it. The fall of the crowns. The war tore through Europe like divine vengeance. 4 great empires fell. The German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and, yes, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburgs, who had ruled since the Middle Ages, were suddenly homeless. Emperor Karl I, the last Habsburg to wear the crown, abdicated in 1918. He fled to Switzerland, where he spent his remaining days dreaming of restoration and writing letters to the Pope. His wife, Empress Zita, stood by him through it all, exiled, impoverished, yet fiercely dignified. She lived until 1989, yes, 1989, witnessing the fall of communism, long after the dynasty she married into had become a chapter in history books. And that's why we call her the last empress. She saw the entire arc, from golden thrones to crumbling ruins, from divine right to democratic reality, from the era of poison to the age of politics. Across the bloodlines. But the fall wasn't just Austrian. It was continental. In Russia, the Romanovs met their own end, dragged into a basement in 1918, executed by revolutionaries. Nicholas II, Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and their children, all gone in a storm of gunfire. The British monarchy survived, but only by changing its name, modernizing, and pretending it had nothing to do with all those German cousins. Spoiler, they had everything to do with them. Even Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, cousin to both the Russian Tsar and the British king, lost his throne, fleeing to the Netherlands in shame. The entire royal web unraveled in less than 5 years. Centuries of cousin marriages, divine right rhetoric, and golden thrones vanished, replaced by republics, revolutions, and modernity. It wasn't poison that killed the monarchies this time. It was progress. Echoes of a golden age. Today, the Habsburg descendants still exist, mostly as polite aristocrats, historians, or sometimes a reality TV curiosity. They appear at weddings, funerals, and sometimes in lawsuits about lost palaces. But the power, the mystery, the divine aura, all gone.
Part 6. Reflections on the poisoned bloodlines, quiet echoes of power. All right, fellow night owl, you've traveled through centuries of dynastic madness, poison, and jaw-breaking Habsburg faces. We've seen queens who could make a room tremble, dukes whose teeth defied human anatomy, and empresses whose beauty was both a curse and a weapon. Before we finally close this long, sleepy odyssey, let's float one last time over the quiet echoes of Europe's poisoned bloodlines. The ghosts that linger. History has a way of leaving shadows. Catherine de Medici's astrologers and apothecaries may be gone, but every European palace still whispers her name. Lucrezia Borgia's smile may have faded from Ferrara, but the legend of the femme fatale continues to color art, theater, and imagination. Charles II of Spain rests in a marble tomb, his fragile body a warning to generations that followed. The Habsburg jaws and inbred crowns are now preserved in portraits, skeletons, and crypts, mute testimony to centuries of human obsession with bloodlines, beauty, and power. Even Sissi, the empress who ran from her gilded cage, and Zita, the last Habsburg to wear the crown, remind us that no matter how divine your heritage, mortality eventually catches up. Why do we remember these stories? Maybe because beneath the tragedy and scandal, there's something deeply relatable. Catherine, Lucrezia, and Sissi were women navigating impossible circumstances. Charles II shows us the limits of heredity and circumstance. The Habsburgs remind us that power without wisdom and ambition without foresight is ultimately fragile. They are cautionary tales, sure, but also quietly human. They loved, they lost, they plotted, they endured. And occasionally, they poisoned someone. Or someone imagined they did. The patterns of power. As we drift above Europe one final time, patterns emerge. Bloodlines over judgment. Marry for power, not for love. Inbreeding was practical, until it wasn't. Legends outlast truth. Rumors of incest, poison, and malice may have been exaggerated, but they survive centuries later. Tragedy is personal. No empire, dynasty, or crown can shield a human heart from loneliness, fear, or grief. The poisoned bloodlines of Europe weren't just a sequence of scandals, they were a mirror. They reflect ambition, obsession, and the costs of trying to control everything. A lullaby for kings and queens. So now, as the candle burns low and the palace halls fall silent, imagine Catherine de Medici poring over her charts, a small ironic smile on her lips. Lucrezia Borgia walking along Ferrara's quiet corridors, her secrets tucked beneath silk gowns. Charles II lying in his Spanish chamber, jaw aching, surrounded by silent tutors. Sissy gazing across Lake Geneva, wind tossing her hair, longing for freedom. Zita in exile, reading letters from a world that no longer recognizes her crown. All of them, in the end, resting. We leave them there, their stories a soft echo in the corridors of history, their mistakes warnings, their lives strangely comforting in their persistence, proof that even amidst chaos, humanity continues, quietly, softly, and imperfectly. Closing whisper. And so, dear listener, as your eyelids grow heavy and your mind drifts into dreams, remember this. Power is intoxicating. Legacy is fragile. And sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that unfold quietly in poisoned whispers, awkward marriages, and fractured crowns. Sleep now. Let the ghosts of kings and queens fade into your imagination. Let the chandeliers of Europe sway gently in your mind's eye. And when you wake, the world will still be here, but the poisoned bloodlines, they will remain forever a soft echo of history's long velvet night. Good night.